Welcome to the homecoming episode of Slate Money, your guide to the business and finance news of the week. I'm Felix Salmon of Axios. Emily Peck is also here from Axios.
Hello, hello.
In the studio, Elizabeth Spiers is in the studio.
Hello.
And also in the studio, we have an amazing, wonderful, brilliant, gorgeous, fabulous person, Rana Foroohar. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Felix. I love you. Love all of you.
You're about to get annoyed at me for pushing back against the thesis of your book.
At least you started well.
But before we do that, tell us, what is this book that you have out?
So the book is called Homecoming, The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World. And I am arguing that we are leaving the neoliberal era and entering a new world, which is going to be somewhat less global, more regional, and more local.
One of my favorite journalism stories when I first started out as a trainee at Euromoney magazine back in the 1990s was one of our star reporters, Ben Edwards, filed a piece of copy, and the first sentence was, "The world is becoming increasingly global." And we all kind of laughed at him. But now I feel like your thesis is that the world is becoming decreasingly global.
It is. The world is not flat.
So we're going to talk about the unflatness and decreasingly global nature of the world. We're going to talk about rare earths, pharmaceuticals, China, Africa. It's a glorious conversation. You're going to love it. And we also have a Slate Plus segment on workplace surveillance. So it's all coming up on Slate Money.
Slate Money is brought to you by Progressive. Are you thinking more about how to tighten up your budget these days? Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and customers can qualify for an average of 6 discounts when they sign up. A little off your rate each month goes a long way. Get a quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who save with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts vary and are not available in all states and situations. Hey there, Slate Money listeners. Before we start the show, I want to let you know about a story coming up a little later. It's from one of our sponsors, Charles Schwab. Schwab's passion for serving clients is inspired directly by the values of the people who work there. It's what sets them apart. Stick around to hear how Jim's approach as a Schwab financial consultant was shaped by values instilled by his father.
So let's start with the book.
Yay.
Obviously. Congrats. You claim...
Wow.
Wait a minute. Already I feel antagonism.
You claim that we can reverse globalization and bring all of the goods and services and manufacturing and everything back like home. That's the theme of the book. And yet also still have all of the jobs and growth and economic utopia that we failed to get under globalization. Is that basically the book?
Oh, Felix, you naughty, naughty boy. No, that's not the book. So look, here's the book. The book is that the last half century of neoliberal globalization. And I say that because, look, over the millennia, there have been many periods of globalization and deglobalization. In fact, that always goes like a pendulum. And economic paradigms in general swing, right? And when they swing too far, then they swing back a little. I'm arguing that the Washington consensus, the trickle-down economics, the idea that capital, goods, and people were all going to flow freely and perfectly across borders, and markets were always going to be efficient, and everything was going to land where it was most productive, that we've realized that that's not working, in part because capital always traveled so much faster than either goods or particularly people, which has essentially favored multinational companies and China for reasons we can tease out. It has favored big over small. It has favored efficient, and I put that in quotation marks, over resilient in terms of our supply chains. And it has favored a very linear one-size-fits-all model for the global economy rather than the sort of heterodoxy that we need in order for nation states to be able to look after their own interests at the same time that they're participating in global markets. So I'm talking about all that and giving you good news about how we can get back to a better balance.
Okay, so let's say I agree with all of that about like.
I'm glad I know you're a friend, because otherwise I would be like, WTF. Okay, go ahead.
No, I do. I think your diagnosis of globalization is exactly correct, and the winners from globalization are exactly the people you say it is, and the downsides of globalization are exactly the downsides that you limb, if that's a good word, in your book. The more interesting thing for me about the book is not so much the neoliberal globalization was bad thing, but the post-neoliberal, post-global world of, homeshoring or friendshoring, whatever you want to call it, is going to be better for like normal people. And that I think is the super interesting thesis. And can you just talk a little bit about what gives you confidence in that?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And I would say I think you're being a little too linear in saying it's not.
As a globalist.
That's right. At least you're not a neoliberal, I don't think. But
I don't know, man. Like, it's hard to tell sometimes.
I know. It is. It really is. Look. We're going to what I would say is a post-neoliberal world. We don't have a complete unified field theory for what that's going to look like yet, although it's interesting. People are starting to pull at that, and we can maybe talk a bit more about that. But my basic thought, and I think you're seeing it play out every day in the news, is that the global markets have run too far ahead of the interests of the nation state. And so that creates not only economic stagnation because, in this country, for example, we've had policy decisions that have been telling us everybody can be a banker or a software developer, and it really doesn't matter if you have an industrial commons. It really doesn't matter if you have a variety of diverse sizes and types of businesses in your community. I don't think that works for average people. I think that you can see that at an economic level. There's a chart, actually, that Heather Boucher at the Council on Economic Advisors often trots out, which is quite telling. If you go back to the late 1970s, which is, pre-Reagan-Thatcher revolution, you could chart GDP growth in a nation with the sort of well-being of families, average per capita income, and corporate growth, and it would be roughly in line. So everything was kind of going in the same direction. After the 1970s, you start to see those lines diverge, and corporate profits might be way up here, the wealth of a country might be somewhere in the middle, and average incomes start to flatten. And that paradigm just, it can't hold. That's why you have stagnant economies, but it's also why you have more polarized politics.
Right, but this is my question, right? Like, 100% those lines have diverged. That's just an empirical fact. My question is, like, if we get rid of the neoliberal paradigm, then what makes you think that they will converge?
Yeah. No silver bullet answer, but I would look at a country like Germany, for example. They have a lot of problems, as we know. You and I have maybe even talked about German banks at some point. I feel like we
had Adam Tooze on a while back, talking about all the problems with Germany.
Oh my God! But one thing that Germans got right is a more collective model about how capitalism should work. You have the sort of co-determination model where you've got the public sector, the private sector, labor working together. You've got a better balance of asset growth and income-based growth. So why do I think we can go back to that? Well, there are several tailwinds fueling a sort of beginnings of deglobalization, regionalization, localization, whatever you want to call it. And here they are. Even before COVID, even before the war in Ukraine, you saw the sort of cheap capital, cheap labor bargain between Asia and the U.S. starting to flatten out. So what do I mean by that? I mean that it no longer made any sense in terms of energy costs, carbon emissions, productivity, wage arbitrage to tote low-margin goods all the way through the South China Seas into the U.S. or Europe, which is why industries like textiles and furniture were already starting to localize and regionalize. That then was put on steroids during COVID, during war in Ukraine, where you start to see all the things that the last half century was predicated on: cheap capital, cheap labor, and cheap energy coming from Russia into Europe. All that starts to go away. And you start to see these highly, efficient, linear supply chains breaking down. And you start to see that there is a politics in the political economy, right? It matters if you have outsourced your entire industrial commons and can no longer make basic PPE or have the ingredients for antibiotics, or have a reliable energy supply or have food supply chains that talk to one another. And I think everybody understands that now. I mean, McKinsey Global Institute, which we can all hate on McKinsey, but the MGI does really great data. They say 92% of multinationals are now regionalizing and localizing. The other reason for that is innovation. Now, I grew up, my dad was an immigrant, was educated in this country. I grew up in rural Indiana in farm community / industrial base for Detroit. He ran factories. It is so obvious to anyone in business that has actually been in manufacturing that you need to be on the ground locally in order to iterate and innovate. We had this crazy idea, which a bunch of neoliberal economists, who shall remain nameless, came up with.
You can name them.
I won't. You can guess.
We're among friends here.
Yeah. Okay. Came up with that. Look, we don't have to actually make anything to have a functioning economy. That's just not true. Look at Elon Musk. Again, somebody that you can hate on or not. But I would say he's at the cutting edge of how you get back to a very high-end, innovative manufacturing environment. And it's all about localization. It's all about vertical integration. It's kind of, you're going back to a model in which you keep small, tight supply chains nearby, which actually allows you to move faster and be more resilient.
How does the political role, what's the role of, politics in this or governments in this? Because it seems like in a way neoliberalism was all about outsourcing the nation state to the WTO or these, international bodies and being all free market, blah, blah, blah. But what we've learned recently, especially with energy, is that the government intervenes. Like, you can't just go for it now with so many supply constraints now around energy and other goods. Yeah. You need governments to be more muscular than before. And is that another pressure leading to sort of the falling apartiness of neoliberalism?
Well, totally. And there's a kind of a big picture point there and then a more practical point. To me, the big picture point is something that we all kind of have really known since the financial crisis. But again, it's become glaringly obvious in recent years, which is that markets aren't always perfect, particularly when it comes to providing public commons type goods, healthcare, energy. You mentioned energy markets. There's a reason that the U.S. and Europe and many countries actually have strategic petroleum reserves, because the markets, particularly in energy, which are super financialized and super volatile, wouldn't always provide that resource, that sort of capacity for an emergency situation. And so governments decided, all right, we need that strategic reserve. I think what you're going to see much more of, and you've already seen some of this with the vaccine efforts, with PPE during COVID, is government starting to provide a floor under certain strategic markets. You can see it with the CHIPS Act, right? Which is very bipartisan, but also with Europe starting to do more building of its own localized semiconductor industry, which P.S., whatever your politics are, whether you're a neoliberal or not, did any of us ever think it was a good idea to have 92% of all the world's high-end semiconductors made in Taiwan, which is possibly the second most contentious place in the world after Ukraine? That was not a safe decision, but that was a purely market decision. So I think what's going to happen now is governments, and this could get risky, are going to have to decide what is strategic, what is not strategic. And some of those conversations are being had not just around things like chips, but around things like rare earth minerals, lithium batteries, drugs and pharma input, food, certain kind of basic apparel, And so I've actually it's interesting, in the last couple of weeks, I've been in a couple of big supply chain, like off-the-record background meetings with public sector officials and private business leaders. And they are desperately trying to figure out, where is everything? Where are the 15 supply chains that we really need? And where's the stuff? Because there's been so much outsourcing that people don't even know how to make their own products anymore. It's scary.
I mean, Exhibit A here, of course, is the United Kingdom, which managed to outsource everything except for City of London finance, and then cut off all of their supply chains by Brexiting, and then they were like, "Oh shit! Now we can't make anything."
100%.
One of the classic things they couldn't make was energy, because like North Sea oil has dried up. And amazingly, this is my favorite thing about the UK. They had this massive natural gas reserve off the coast of Norfolk, I think it was, and then they just shut it down because they couldn't pay. They decided it was too expensive to renovate and keep up. So they just so suddenly their one ability to have that, the UK equivalent of the strategic petroleum reserve, just evaporated basically. Then they were
I
shit.
totally agree with you. I think that the UK is like Exhibit A of just the backfiring of all possible neoliberal policies. You can just look at the Liz Truss, blowing up post, "Oh, hey, let's do trickle-down economics again. Let's give a huge tax cut to the wealthiest people at the same time that we're actually going to do more government spending." It's like the Reagan playbook, And hello, 44 days later, 45, what was it? She's out of there.
So let me ask you about vaccines, because I think that was one of the many, many things we learned over the course of the pandemic was the vaccines were the Exhibit A in where beautiful global seamless supply chains broke down. And you got this extreme vaccine nationalism where if you were a country which manufactured the vaccine, you kept it all to yourself in the first place. And only once you'd vaccinated everyone in your country, even if they weren't really at risk, would you export it to people who really needed it in even somewhere like Canada. So that explains why Canada got vaccinated so much later than the United States. Is the solution to this for Canada to build its own pharmaceutical industry? Because that seems weird.
No, not at all. I think the solution is what a friend of mine, Barry Lynn, who runs the Open Markets Institute, has called the rule of 4. And so I think that in really crucial areas, and those are, TBD, but we can kind of guess what they are: food, fuel, drugs, vaccines, antibiotics, important things like that. You need to have capacity in 4 geographies. You need to have capacity in 4 large players. It's a general rule, but it's a way of saying you need some redundancy in the system in a world in which bad stuff is probably going to happen more often, and not just geopolitically bad stuff, but viruses, climate events. This is another thing that even before COVID and Ukraine, you could track the number of supply chain disruptions that big companies and countries were dealing with was increasing exponentially because of everything from climate change to more fractious politics to the migration issues that would then the political economy issues that would occur because of that. So we need to get a little stronger. We need to get a little more resilient, and that means more places. Now, in terms of Canada's, you're raising an important point, which is every single country should not be replicating every other country's efforts, nor can they. But I think that you're going to see a new regionalism. You can actually already see it. I mean, speaking of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, former FT colleague, who's the deputy premier.
Deputy Prime Minister.
The deputy prime minister.
You can call it deputy premier.
But came out with a really interesting speech along these lines. And, I would have said that Chrystia is pretty neoliberal, but she hasn't been neoliberal since she became an MP. I don't think. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, maybe you can't get elected that way.
Can I cut you guys off for a second? And can you define neoliberal?
Yeah.
Because I feel like it gets tossed around a lot as it's a slur in some circles, some progressive circles at this point. So it'd be good to.
I would say it's a slur.
It's a slur.
Yeah. So let me define the word neoliberal, because you're right. It does get tossed around a lot, and it gets used in an economic way, but also in a political way, and it's used quite differently sometimes in Europe versus the U.S. I'm actually defining it, and I do in my book, as the IMF does. And interestingly, the IMF, which kind of represents neoliberalism has started hating on neoliberalism too. That's a separate thread. But they would define it as the economic philosophy defined in some ways by the Washington Consensus that capital, goods, and people should move transparently, easily across borders, and that crucially, they would always land where it was most productive and best from a market perspective for them to do so. So it's the kind of totally laissez-faire, free markets lift all boats idea. And in fact, that was true for a while, and you take it all the way up from the 80s to, the apex of global growth would be about between 2003 and 2007, which interestingly, right in the middle of that is when Tom Friedman wrote The World is Flat, that's the shorthand for neoliberalism. The world is flat, borders don't matter, place doesn't matter, messy humans don't matter, messy institutions don't matter, markets are perfect. That's neoliberalism, and it's just wrong.
Yeah, that is wrong. I get why.
And so the solution to that, or the post neoliberal consensus, which I've written about a little bit, and as you said, doesn't really exist yet, but is slowly coming together. What you're saying is, especially for something like pharmaceuticals, we're going to be more sort of regionally based. There'll be like something in Brazil, something in the US, something in Europe, something in Africa. Obviously China. China's always going to have everything. And then that will give the world the level of redundancy that it needs.
I think so. And, you mentioned China. When we talk about decoupling, one of the points that I really like to make is we often think about decoupling, deglobalization, regionalization, economic warfare, as Biden is being accused of recently in terms of the chip ban, which we should talk about, as something that the U.S. is driving and that the West is driving. I would argue that it's something that China decided quite a while ago. If you look back to 2015, they put out their Made in China 2025 plan, which said, look, we want to have what's called, in the very wonky way, a dual circulation economy. What that means, that's official Chinese state language.
It sounds like an immersion heater.
It's something very engineering, which is sort of also very Chinese, but that they want to essentially produce and consume locally, that they are now rich enough that they don't want to just be the exporting factory to the world, that they want to actually regionalize their supply chains and produce more for the domestic market and also more for the Asian market, which, frankly, put aside any crazy politics, Xi Jinping, Donald Trump, whatever, it makes sense. It makes sense for a lot of reasons. It makes sense environmentally. Shorter supply chains are better for climate. It makes sense from a resilience standpoint. It makes sense from a fuel standpoint. It makes sense from an upskilling standpoint. So they had decided way back in 2015, this is the way that they were going. Then you have, in the U.S., Trump coming into office, and he had no coherent policy about anything, really, but Bob Lighthizer, who was the USTR at that point, did something which I was actually for, and that is in putting tariffs on various products from China, he kind of pulled back the scrim and called bullshit on this willful blindness, which has been going on for years, decades even, between U.S. multinationals and policymakers and Beijing, which is we're all going to pretend here that China doesn't have a totally different political economy than the U.S. or most parts of Europe, and that we're all going to come seamlessly into the Washington Consensus together, and everybody's going to follow WTO rules, and it's all going to be great. No, that was never the case. I remember going to China, it was actually around the time of the Edward Snowden leaks, and talking to a Danish wind CEO who was at that time number one in the market in China. And I was like, so how are things going? How's the next 5 years going to be? And he said, oh, I think it'll be pretty good. We're going to be, I think in 5 years, we'll be in the number 4 spot. And I was like, well, wait a minute. First of all, how do you know that so precisely? And secondly, why is that good news? You're going from 1 to 4. And he's like, well, that's what Beijing has told us. Hello? That's how things operate. So why were we always pretending that it was going to be different? So then you get Biden sort of coming in and basically agreeing with the trade policies of the Trump administration, but then adding what I think has been a very smart layer of let's look at what's happening domestically. Let's create more resiliency. Let's rethink our economy.
So there was an interesting tension between Biden and his Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen over this issue, right, was that we reported this at Axios, that when inflation started picking up, she was like, well, the obvious thing to do to bring inflation down is to get rid of all of those tariffs because all of the tariffs were inflationary. And Biden was kind of just basically ignored her and never did it. And what you're saying is in that tension between Biden and Yellen, you're like Team Biden.
Totally Team Biden. Now, it's fair to say that decoupling is going to be somewhat inflationary in the short term. I actually think it's going to be wildly deflationary in the mid to longer term. But this is the rub. This is the political problem. We've gotten used to the cheap is better, cheaper, drive down consumer prices. That's all that matters. As long as consumer prices are falling and share prices are up, it's all good. Unfortunately, and this is a difficult thing to message, all those cheap flat screen TVs at Walmart have not made up for the fact that the things that make you middle class, education, healthcare, housing, have been rising even before the latest couple of years of inflationary pressures were rising at 3 times the core inflation rate. Now they're rising wildly faster. If you look actually with the interest rate hikes, the price of carrying a mortgage from last year on year is up over 50%. So the truth of the matter is that cheap stuff is going to make us all feel better and make us middle class. That paradigm is tapped out, but it doesn't solve the problem of the next few quarters and years, particularly for working people, of holy cow, like putting groceries on the table has just gotten wildly more expensive. Can I eat meat? Can I pay for my prescription drugs? These are structural problems. And so what I think when you say Team Biden, I am Team Biden on this conceptually, but I also think that as with every paradigm shift, it's going to start with Biden, but it's going to take another couple of presidencies, I think, to get to the other side of where we're going. And there's going to be a lot of bumps in between.
Yeah, you have a great line in the book where you say something like you're comparing the increase of the hospitality industry with the decrease of manufacturing. And you say, we've become a nation that doesn't make things anymore. We just eat things.
Yeah.
So when you think about the weaknesses that we have, what are we not making that we should be besides semiconductors?
That's a great question. I'll actually flip it a little bit and say that one of the things that surprised me in my reporting is how we can still make things. So let me give you an example from the textile industry. I followed textiles because I thought it was like a really cool Darwinian case study. When China came into the WTO in 2001, apparel basically just went to Asia, full stop. What was left was like a Harvard Business School case study of how you want to run a business. There's a very strong middle market, typically private, often family-owned group of businesses in the Carolinas that still make certain kinds of apparel. And when COVID hit, nobody's buying T-shirts and, even underwear, and because we're all sitting at home in our sweats. And so these guys are like, oh, God, okay, what are we going to do? Well, let's make masks. So they turn on a dime and in 48 hours basically come up with their own little homegrown industrial policy to make masks. P.S. with no help from Peter, Buy America, Go MAGA people, Navarro, who didn't even know anything about this supply chain. It's almost like the counterexample that proves the rule. What has survived in this country is small, mid-market, and below the radar of the pressures of Wall Street. How we bring that back and how we create scale in that is going to involve a lot of different things. It's going to involve, first of all, making sure that we enforce antitrust policy so these companies that do still make things don't get acquired by private equity, which is starting to eye mid-market industrials in the U.S. And then government needs to decide, all right, what is important? I would argue that there are somewhere between 5 and 10 supply chains that you want to have a lot of resiliency in. Semiconductors and tech components are one of those. Rare earth minerals are one of those. Pharma and pharma inputs, antibiotics are one of those. Certain amount of food would be part of that. And so We're going to have to use antitrust policy. We're going to have a little bit of industrial policy. California's kind of leading the way on this in an interesting sense. Alice Waters, the famous restaurateur from Chez Panisse, who's very big into the slow food movement and kind of localization of food. She's actually doing a really interesting cutting-edge experiment. She is trying to get the entire University of California system to cut out middlemen, big, large institutional middlemen like the Ciscos of the world, and buy totally local food supply. And once she does that at University of California, which she's on the way to doing, she wants to do it in K through 12 in California. And then that becomes a model of how do you use government procurement to create that resiliency at a local level.
Support for this podcast comes from Wise, the universal account that lets you send, spend, and receive money internationally. With one account for over 50 currencies, who exactly is Wise made for? It's made for Austrians uprooting to Australia, Swedes safarying in South Africa. It's made for business in Tokyo and pleasure in Miami. Wise is made for people without borders. People who believe that using your money should be easy, even if life gets complicated. You see, with Wise, you always get the mid-market exchange rate with no markups and no hidden fees, helping you save on currency conversion wherever your money takes you. Wise. It's the account that's made for the world. Join 13 million customers and learn how the Wise account could work for you at wise.com/slatemoney. Can we talk about notifications for a second? Who actually leaves those sounds on anymore? Well, beside that kind. That's another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform to start, run, and grow your business. Shopify makes it simple to sell to anyone from anywhere, whether your thing is vintage teas or recipes. Start selling with Shopify and join the platform simplifying commerce for millions of your favorite businesses worldwide. So, I've always kind of wanted to start my own business, and it's cool to know that Shopify is out there if I ever take that big step into the entrepreneurial world. When I'm ready, or when you're ready to launch your thing into the spotlight, do it with Shopify, the commerce platform backing millions of businesses down the street and around the globe. Sign up for a free trial at shopify.com/money, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/money to start selling online today. Shopify.com/money.
Let me ask you about the tension here with environmentalism. You mentioned rare earths, and one of the great misnomers in the world is rare earths. Rare earths are not rare. They're in every piece of dirt in the world, pretty much. The problem with rare earths is not finding them. It's the sheer filthiness and dirt of actually getting them out of the earth. And it is a horribly nasty, dirty thing to do. And so the places that do it are obviously China and somewhere like Japan will find some island that it isn't inhabiting, and they're like, we can just destroy this island and we can extract rare earths from it and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
It seems like, as a globalist, that's kind of like, if you're going to have to create a bunch of environmental destruction in order to get these rare earths out of the ground, doing it in some uninhabited island in the China Sea is probably the right place to do it, rather than doing it in, a national park in the United States, right? Do you really want that stuff to be happening onshore?
It's a great question. It is already happening on shore. There are some mines in the West do get, and in fact, you may have seen that Canada is ramping up and Australia are ramping up.
Canada, home of the tar sands and other such places. Yeah, Canada's good at ripping itself up for commodities.
Yeah. No, these are great questions, and actually, it sort of touches on a point that came up in my book. One of the things I was looking at in agriculture is hyper-localized farming. So big ag is one of the most polluting things that you can do to the planet, basically. We're, as we all probably know, we're incentivized to raise cash crops to feed cattle. I grew up in farm country. All the corn around me was for feeding cattle, not people. It's just a crazy model. And meanwhile, we are not producing enough fruits and vegetables. Okay, so one of the solutions to this is something called vertical farming, which is done. It's very cool. It's done a lot, particularly in California. Like Google serves all the produce on its campus in California from these vertical farms that you can grow up the side of walls or on buildings. And this is something that's being trialed in cities and urban areas. It can be a way to cut energy usage and carbon emissions, but it also costs a lot to build these things environmentally and physically, and it costs a lot to run them energy-wise. So you start to get into that arbitrage of, all right, you want to make lithium batteries, you've got to dig up this stuff. Like, what is the cost? What is the true holistic cost of a product? And I think that that's actually really crucial to my thesis. We thought that cheap was just about price. But when you factor in the true cost of something, even just this glass, which California is also starting to do now with its green purchasing, what are the carbon emissions if this was made in Xinjiang to get this here? What are the labor standards? What is the tally and the cost of that versus if it was made in Tennessee? That's something that we are just starting to tally up. The SEC is thinking about this. The White House is thinking about it because the Inflation Reduction Act, the carrots and sticks involved in that are going to require actually understanding the true costs of these things. So at some point, we're going to have to grapple with, well, shoot, is it worth it to dig up those rare minerals in Canada? What does that mean in terms of the cost of an entire product? It also gets into the messy stakeholder versus shareholder debate. If low consumer prices and high stock prices are not the end-all, be-all metric, what are the metrics? Messy questions.
I feel like you just made a great case for a carbon tax there.
Oh, honestly, I think a price on carbon, first of all, it's such a no-brainer. Like, hello, Republicans. The way to both make America great again and reduce Chinese mercantilism is to come up with a price on carbon, because it would end Chinese mercantilism like overnight. So can we please get together with Europe and do that? Also, Democrats, it's easier than the way we're doing it now.
Wait, Rana, so the argument that I think the neoliberals, who I just learned what that means, but fine. The one they always use, and people like Felix, I think, believe, is that if there's more globalism and there's trade and you have to have relationships with these countries that politically are different from you, that's good. It keeps the peace. You're not going to go to war, like Thomas Friedman said. Isn't there some
the golden arches theory?
Which P.S. stopped working when Yugoslavia fell apart.
But isn't there some truth to that? If you have these relationships, that does give you some, to use the word everyone likes now, is resiliency in your foreign relations. So what do you do about that?
Well, I mean, the thesis being basically, and I'm not sure I do believe this, but I will believe it for the purposes of this podcast because I need someone to. But the thesis basically being that if it wasn't for the fact that Taiwan produced 92% of the world's semiconductors, China probably would have invaded them by now.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a very interesting and difficult question. But let me start with this idea: does trade make us friendlier? Does trade make us freer? Like everything, this is not a binary conversation. I think to a certain extent, relationships make sense. But I think where we fell down, and this was particularly true, I would say, in the late Clinton administration, when you started seeing all kinds of trade deals being cut with countries that had pretty wildly different political systems, political economies, and values, you start to get this kind of willful blindness to the idea that, wow, we're not playing by the same set of rules. That's why you have a WTO that just doesn't function anymore, because China is never going to play by the rules of the WTO, which would involve, as you come into this organization, not subsidizing certain crucial industries. That's just not going to happen. Trade is necessary, but the idea that trade is going to make everybody be more like us, which was kind of the world is flat way of looking at things, I think is naive. And it's also, I've always found it quite arrogant. I remember the first few times I went to China looking around just thinking, oh my God, this is an amazing, diverse, crazy, country with its own traditions and the idea that it's ever going to really embrace our system, I always thought that was naive.
I guess I just meant as a baseline for like not going to war or something.
Well, it hasn't, though. I mean, it really, as we can kind of see. And in fact, I would argue, to me, the conflict is around the fact that while trade created, and neoliberal trade, let's say, created more wealth at a global level than ever before, it also created more in-country inequality than ever before. Yeah. In most OECD countries, particularly in the Anglo-American world.
I think in pretty much all countries. I mean,
in pretty much all countries, yeah.
Including China.
Including China. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And so that, in different ways, started to create political fractures that undermine the entire system. So I guess that's my pushback to the world is flat argument.
And that's one of the reasons why the Chinese government is now like pulling back on that entire policy, is because it's presumably because they see the problems of inequality, and if they cut down the billionaires, then that will reduce inequality.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point too, and I'd be curious what you all think about this. But I'm fascinated by their common prosperity campaign, which. Again, let's take Xi Jinping out of the equation because he's kind of the wild card. Is he the new Mao, or is he actually kind of, he's like a stealth populist that's taking China to a better place? Common prosperity is essentially about curbing Chinese elites. It's about it's the Chinese way of reducing the wealth gap, and maybe that's not a bad thing.
This podcast is brought to you by Slate Studios and Charles Schwab. The people at Charles Schwab go the extra mile to help clients on their investment journey. It's part of who they are. Jim is a Schwab financial consultant. His dad was a contractor who prided himself on providing great work at a fair price.
I can remember installing windows with my dad and would have to go order the windows from the distributor. And we could have bought cheaper windows. He's like, no, I don't want to buy those. If I put those in, winter's going to come. They're going to be cold. My dad instilled in me, be proud of offering a good quality product at a fair price.
Jim brings this integrity to how he serves his clients each and every day.
I know from 20 years of doing this that if you just help people and give them the guidance that they're looking for, it'll work out in the long run. They don't have to buy anything from you today. They don't have to pay you any money or commissions today. People are looking for good, honest, quality, intelligent service. I always put the people before the money. Always.
At Charles Schwab, they're not just financial people. They're people too. With 24/7 support and one-on-one guidance from financial consultants, Schwab offers the tools to help you pursue your financial goals. Learn more about what sets Schwab apart at schwab.com/whyschwab.
This message is brought to you by Discover. Did you know you could reduce the number of unwanted calls and emails with online privacy protection, the latest innovation from Discover? Discover will help regularly remove your personal info, like your name and address, from 10 popular people search websites that could sell your data, and they'll do it for free. Activate in the Discover app. See terms and learn more at discover.com/online privacy protection.
This episode of Slate Money is brought to you by Best Buy. Whether you're searching for exciting gifts, trying to snag the hottest holiday deals, or looking for ways to simplify the giving and receiving experience, Best Buy is here to help. They have the best assortment of impactful tech gifts. They have, an air fryer if you want to help an aspiring foodie in your life, or a new phone or a camera, or you might be on the hunt for a new smartwatch to support a friend's wellness journey. No matter what you're looking for, Best Buy is your gifting destination for everyone on your list. And Best Buy makes it easy to get your gifts how and when you need them with free next-day delivery on thousands of items, as well as same-day delivery and in-store pickup options. Shop great deals on gifts now at Best Buy. So I wanted to top this off by just like rolling out a Bono quote and letting you rip because
oh my God, Bono.
Because
if this is about globalists, we have to have Bono there.
we have to have Bono on. Now, I one of my unpopular opinions is that Bono is arguably the most successful philanthropist of the modern era. I think he has absolutely done a huge amount of good in the world. Not everyone agrees with me on this one, but he also, as you know, after hanging out with him for many decades at the World Economic Forum,
Never again.
is a true globalist. And so I want to. This is a quote he gave to the New York Times. He said, "I ended up as an activist in a very different place from where I started. I thought that if we just redistributed resources, then we could solve every problem. I now know that's not true. There's a funny moment when you realize that, as an activist, the off-ramp out of extreme poverty is commerce, it's entrepreneurial capitalism. I spend a lot of time in countries all over Africa, and they're like, hey, we wouldn't mind a little more globalization, actually." Is he right? Is he wrong?
Well, he's right that commerce is where prosperity comes from in a capitalist system. I mean, business is how wealth is created. It's funny, when I talk to Africans, absolutely they want more commerce, but increasingly they're doing it in a regional way. Africa is actually in this new post-neoliberal world. I think that they may have an opportunity, and I don't want to be sanguine or naive because they've got a lot of challenges, but because they are a place that has food, fuel, and potentially more consumer demand, they're well placed for more regional hubbing. And you're starting to see that now, where a lot of African countries are coming together and doing cross-border business. And there's also, and this is true in many developing countries, there's an elite that has been educated abroad, maybe has worked abroad for a while, that's coming back. This was the case with my dad, by the way. My dad's a Turkish immigrant. He was like the last generation of Turks to come to the U.S. and be educated here and stay here because it was going to be better economically. Turkey, until the recent crackdown over the last few decades, was that you were more likely to get wealthy more quickly or have more opportunity there. Same with sea turtles in China, these kind of expats going home. So I see a lot of Africans, particularly South Africans, coming back and saying, we want to develop regionally. We don't want to just be a place that the Chinese or the Americans, frankly, come in and mine raw materials and, have no infrastructure ourselves. They have a really strong digital economy, so I think that they're actually poised for a new kind of regionalism. So I guess if it's about a binary, you have to have a one-size-fits-all globalism in order to be prosperous, then I would disagree with Bono.
Yeah. I will push back on this optimism about African regionalism, mainly because I think that, and this is getting a little bit nerdy, but mainly just because I think that in order to have a regional economy, you need strong, internal transportation ties. You need that interstate highway system. You need, the European rail system, something like that. That basically just doesn't exist in Africa. It has a coastline, and you can get from the coast to anywhere in the world on a boat. But if you want to try to go from anywhere in Africa to anywhere else in Africa, especially over land, you basically can't do it. And that, I think, is just going to prevent an African regional economy from evolving. Maybe you could get a West African regional economy with Nigeria and Ghana, and Ivory Coast, but I feel like a continental one is the only way you're going to get that, frankly, is through Belt and Road infrastructure investment from China.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I think that's an interesting case. I think you probably can make that argument about traditional goods and services trade. The thing that's interesting, though, is the way that the Africans have leapfrogged ahead in digital. I mean, it's just fascinating because, it's the classic thing where because they didn't have old line infrastructure, they're actually really ahead, kind of like the Chinese in some ways. They're quite ahead in a lot of wireless innovation. There's a super rich digital media landscape there. You've got farmers doing things, trading and doing things on apps that farmers in this country don't do. So, I can see it both ways. Maybe I'm being too optimistic about Africa, but I like to be optimistic about Africa. Nobody is, so I will be.
Yeah, I think the problem with the Bono quote is that it has a little bit of shades of, learn to code. If you're in an area where people have social problems. And so, if you assume that commerce is the solution to all of this, how do you envision it scaling over time?
How do I envision African commerce scaling? Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, it kind of already is. Actually, I spent a while in Nigeria a few years back looking at the digital media landscape, and it's really interesting. They have Nollywood, it's the third largest film industry in the world after Hollywood and Bollywood. And it's about creating content for 300 million Yoruba speakers globally. I mean, expats. This is now turning into an app economy. You've got Google and Apple over there seeding these entrepreneurs. Now, interestingly, the biggest roadblock is infrastructure. It's what Felix was saying earlier. So you've got in Nigeria, you've got basically two infrastructure systems. One that's kind of shoddy, that's run by the state, and one that's really good, that's run by a couple of billionaires. And so you need to get bridge that gap.
I feel like we should have a numbers round. Emily, did you bring a number?
Yes,
you
I
did.
remember.
What was your
Yeah.
number?
My number is 250,000. That is the maximum amount of dollars you could be fined for breaking New York City's new salary transparency law, which went into effect this week.
That.
Yeah. So now employers who hire people who work in New York City, if you have more than 4 employees, you have to post salary ranges in your job listings in good faith. And that went into effect this week. And I recommend just going and looking at job listings for the company you work at, because you can see how much they pay people, and it's endlessly fascinating. And some companies post these ranges that are just, one media company has like a listing for editor that pays between $50,000 a year and $180,000 a year.
So, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Like, obviously, a range like that is not particularly informative.
I think it is actually informative, because you kind of ignore the lower end of it if you're an applicant and you say, oh, okay, you look, from what I've heard from HR people and recruiters, everyone just looks at the top number anyway. So you look at the top number and you're like, that's my goal.
You know what that says to me, though? I'm fascinated by the range because it speaks to the nebulous way in which people are paid. And what is that about? Who gets the 180? I think I can probably imagine some of what goes into that.
It's always the women of color, I'm telling you.
But to put that number out there is important for those people who never get the 180, because they might not even have the 180 in their head as a possibility, because, what happens now in recruiting is the employer asks you, what do you want to make? And you name your price. And typically women, people of color, they might name a price that's a little lower. Now they have a high end they can at least refer to. That might help.
Yeah. My number was from, I think, the same story, but it was a range, and it was a 0 to $2 million. And this was for a Citigroup client service officer position. And some of this was all supposed to go into effect on Tuesday, and some of these companies are just scrambling to add the data to the job listings, or they just don't really understand how the concept works. So if
that was just a computer glitch.
I emailed Citi. They fixed it.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Rana's right. The ranges are so broad in a lot of cases that, they're not telling you what the intention of the law is. So.
But it'll be interesting to see whether and when and how anyone actually gets fined for violating this law. I think it'll take a couple years before we get the first fines, because, we're going to...
If ever,
honestly, yeah. But it will be companies who just don't do it at all, I think, in the first instance.
There is some reporting. The Journal had a good story that some companies are like, we're just taking our listings down. Just call our, just look into us. Just
call the recruiters.
Yeah. And we'll do it, word of mouth kind of a thing. And just, we're not going to bother with this. But big employers can't do that.
But that's also like, the way that C-suite executives have always been hired, right? Like, no one's ever posted a job listing for CEO.
Right.
You know what I find interesting? I actually am writing a column about this topic. I think that the transparency that's coming out of all this is going to push not only greater transparency around other forms of compensation, shares, not bonuses, what are those structures? But I think it's also going to start to open up the corporate black box, which is something I'm becoming obsessed with. Like the amount of legal structures that are in place that allow companies to hide almost everything that goes on, except for the most basic financial information, is kind of shocking. And I think that you're going to see that start to change.
Which is a perfect segue into my number, which is 314 million, which is also an African number, which is the number of dollars that Glencore was fined this week for fining a bunch of African oil officials. Glencore is this massive commodities trading house, and between 2011 and 2016, the Serious Fraud Office in the UK found that it had bribed a bunch of agents in, get this, Nigeria, Cameroon, the Ivory Coast, Equatorial Guinea, and South Sudan, $29 million to, facilitate movement of its oil over other people's oil, that kind of thing. Interesting, actually, that this fine came from the UK. Normally, it's the Americans who are cracking down on the FCPA stuff, but this is a global company, and
they also need the money.
Yeah, the UK could do with that.
One agency that's still working in the UK.
Yeah. Exactly.
But Rana, what's your number?
So I have kind of a boring number, but I think it opens up an interesting question. 261,000, which is the number of jobs created last month, which is a pretty robust number still. And it brings to mind, why the heck are the Democrats not getting more credit for the fact that there's so much still going right in the economy?
Oh my God. Have you gone to a store lately, though? I mean, everything costs so much money now.
It does, but so like how can you I'm thinking about this just like we have to perform this public service. Yes, inflation is bad for all kinds of reasons, almost none of which have to do with the White House. Okay, let's be honest. We've had 40 years of low declining
how much
rate.
of that 261,000 is thanks to the White House?
Also, it doesn't. The average person doesn't know about the 261,000.
The one thing that we've definitely been reporting and has become abundantly clear is that Americans care more about inflation than they do about employment.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Because as long as you have a job, that's all set.
Yeah. It also may speak to the fact that the employment numbers in general are so screwed up. I mean, how many of us have more than one job? Like me?
Well, I mean, some of us moonlight as podcasters.
I know. Does that even count as a job? I feel like we're just like hanging out.
I mean, have you entered your salary into the BLS's inflation calculator?
No.
It's brutal.
Is it?
And
Yeah.
and the wage inflation has not kept up with any other inflation.
No, of course
Corporate
not.
profits have far outpaced inflation while people
haven't.
working are losing money.
Corporate profits have not outpaced
In the
inflation.
oil industry, at least. Quickly backtracked. But anyway, people's wages have not kept up with inflation, and that sucks. And that is why Biden is
I was, just
struggling.
to go back to Republicans for a minute, I was really, Orrin Cass, who's at the American Enterprise Institute, wrote an interesting op-ed in the FT recently, which I was fascinated by because he's a conservative. He's a thoughtful conservative. But he was like WTF, at what point do wages stop shrinking? At what point do companies stop saying we have to continue to pressure labor? The math doesn't work.
Speaking my language.
I think this is also why there's an emerging labor movement here that's it's really vital right now, and it's growing. So
I
it's
feel
just
like
as a
it's
reaction.
not. I don't think it is. I think you see like 8 million individual Starbucks stores all trying to individually unionize, and that's going to get you nowhere.
Well, that's a huge problem with the American labor movement, that you don't have more kind of overall secular organizing.
Right.
That's
I don't see any actual mass.
The numbers are going up. I mean,
yeah, but not very fast.
And that's the problem. I mean, when you talk about supply chain resiliency and onshoring and da-da-da-da-da, we need to talk more about the human supply chain and how to make that more resilient. And I don't see that happening.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't have the number for this, but one trend that I'm watching is the care economy. So and by that, I mean not just healthcare, but education, childcare, basically anything that is a kind of a heart job and a hand job. Those are going to be, sorry, you're going to cut that, right?
We are not going to cut that. We are going to call this one the hand job edition of Slate Manor.
As I bump my nose on this large phallic object right in front of me.
The hand job economy will always be strong.
I need to stop. Can we stop now?
We can stop.
We can stop. I think we can leave. I think hand
leave
jobs
it
is a good place to leave this one.
You guys are Awesome.
But yeah, thank you for coming on.
Oh,
It's been
thanks for
so
having me.
great, so great having you. And thank you all for listening. It's been a fun one, obviously, because Rana's been here. We will be back next week with more Slate Money. Send us what you want us to talk about. slatemoney@slate.com. We'll be back next week.
This message is brought to you by Discover. Did you know you could reduce the number of unwanted calls and emails with online privacy protection, the latest innovation from Discover? Discover will help regularly remove your personal info, like your name and address, from 10 popular people search websites that could sell your data, and they'll do it for free. Activate in the Discover app. See terms and learn more at discover.com/online privacy protection.